Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and good day to you, fellow rebels, my friends in freedom, colleagues in conservatism, and compadres in patriotism. It is so great to have you joining me on the line whenever or wherever you're listening from. This is Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. My name is Andrew Lawton, and man, oh man, there is a lot to talk about in this show. This is the first return to regular broadcasting after the election, or I suppose regular podcasting would be a better way of describing things. In the episode before the election, the week of the election, I had a bit of a different style of show. I was talking about the importance of the election, the issues of the election, the issues of the campaign, and then I had the somewhat melancholy postmortem, which I recorded. I think I actually recorded that one early. I recorded it the day after the election last week. And today we're kind of back to normal. We're going to have a regularly formatted show. We're going to have perhaps a little bit less screaming and shouting at your computers while you listen this time around, because now it's all about the next 4 years. Now it's all about where we go and what we do from here. And when I did my post-election show, I actually got a hugely positive, actually a lot of feedback on that, and I appreciate that. I like hearing from all of you. My email, andrew@andrewlawton.ca. People who really liked the point that I made about conservatives needing to focus more on the culture war than on elections. And I actually ended up parlaying what I spoke about last week on the show into a column which was in the Toronto Sun this week. And if you have a look at me on Twitter, @Andrew Lawton, you'll see exactly where the link to that story is, and you'll hear some familiar thoughts from it. And the point that I was making was that we need to focus on how we change minds and change hearts and how we impact pop culture and how we fight on the values front. Values, conservatism versus progressivism, freedom versus liberalism, independence versus statism. These are the battles that we need to sell. We need to make it so that it doesn't matter how well the parties in Ottawa campaign, because the voters have been sold on the ideology underlying it. And then the one point I didn't get into last week, and I actually didn't even have room to get into it in the piece, is that it will then force the Conservative Party to be more conservative. And as much as I disliked John Robson's essentially nuclear opposition to the Conservatives, I couldn't disagree with him in the campaign, because he wasn't fighting the Conservatives for being conservative. He was fighting them for not being, for focusing on things like boutique tax credits instead of wholesale reductions in what taxes Canadians are paying. So that was something that I think can be jiving with what I'm arguing for, which is bringing the Conservative Party back to its roots as a party of conservative values. And that was one thing that everyone has always, I think, look, even the left has had to acknowledge this, that the Reform Party had going for it, is that they never really lost their way. Now, has Preston Manning lost his way now? That's another story altogether, and maybe we'll have to do a show just about that. But I won't bore you with much in the way of post-election commentary right now, except to say that you should look at my piece, which is called Culture War Matters More Than Elections, in the Toronto Sun on Wednesday, October 28th, as well as in other Sun papers as well. But I know for sure it was in the Toronto Sun. I wanted to talk about one of the least political and most pertinent stories that I think has come up this week, and that has been the war on bacon. I know. I'll always remember where I was when I heard the news that bacon and red meat and sausages could now cause cancer and are in the same category as tobacco, asbestos, and diesel fumes. Now, some people have their bacon and eggs. I wake up every morning and I was already eating tobacco, asbestos, and diesel fumes anyway. So for me, that was actually a somber reminder that maybe I should probably change up my breakfast habits. But the interest that I have seen in this story is far and beyond whatever I've seen in past announcements by the World Health Organization. I don't think people generally pay as much attention nor care as much about what they do. Certainly not that I've seen anyway. And this I find to be rather amusing because most people are either going to eat healthily or unhealthily. Most people who eat unhealthily know and don't care. I don't think anyone's even looking at the Canada Food Guide, let alone the World Health Organization guidelines. So this is not an example of the nanny state taking over. And this was where I think even people on the right got this one wrong. They thought that the World Health Organization was basically becoming a facilitator to the nanny state, that all of a sudden governments like that of Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom and all of these other jurisdictions are going to start banning bacon. And the war on bacon was catchy, it was fun, everyone loves bacon, so it's easy to sell it that way. But the fact remains that not really much has changed here. Not really much has changed here because no country has responded to this. And for starters, these are just guidelines. But I don't put the blame on the World Health Organization. I put the blame on media. I put the blame of this craze on media who doesn't know and doesn't really care about honest reporting on matters of health and matters of science. And this is where I think all of us should be able to find some level of common ground here. And there's a bit of a history here too. Because for starters, media outlets do not know how to report on science. A lot of them have science reporters, but they are reporters who have found their way into the science beat. They aren't scientists. They aren't people that understand the methodologies of other issues. They aren't people who understand the methodologies of these procedures and studies and research and all of this stuff. They are people that have learned how to write about it. And when you are summarizing a years-long study into basically a headline, you're obviously going to be leaving a little bit of the nuance and the actual science out of it. And this is something that I don't think people necessarily realize. And it's also something that, by the way, I haven't even realized until relatively recently. And that's because I've got caught up in this as well. You know, study says cup of coffee a day good for you. Study says people who drink 3 glasses of wine live longer. Study says a stick of bacon a day keeps the doctor away, whatever the case may be. Media outlets have to find a way to sell this research, which is often about something entirely different, or it was about 20 different conclusions, and this is the one that is more populist. Because let's face it, most scientific research is pretty boring, and a great deal of it gets disproven later on. Many of you may remember, I talked about it on the show. There was a study that came out, again, another study, a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was a couple of months ago, and it was basically a study that in the field of psychology recreated famous psychological studies and found that 90% of them, I think it was 90%, I may be a couple of points off, could not be replicated. So the results of their studies could not be reproduced. Now, it doesn't mean that the original studies were fraudulent or that there was any wrongdoing, simply that there is an imperfection in the sciences, especially in sciences like psychology. So where do we go from here? Does this mean don't believe anything in a study? No. It means take it with a grain of salt, or I suppose sodium's bad now. So take it with a grain of asbestos, why don't you? Because we're still on that topic here for W.H.O. But also challenge media, and if you are really interested in a particular example that you've read, here's the big one. Look at the actual study itself. Read the executive summary or the abstract of the study, not the 600-word newspaper article about it. And this is a very important instruction, I think, because I've done this just as a matter of habit now whenever I'm looking to talk about one on my show. And sometimes the executive summary doesn't even really say the same stuff as the news article, or the article doesn't say the same as the headline. These are all relatively common phenomena. So going back, though, to the WHO study, the World Health Organization study, the research, and everyone knows this now because it's been shared at probably more and more people and by more people's Facebook pages than that black and blue or red or gold dress thing a few months ago, whatever the case may be. It says that the risk of developing cancer, the risk of developing colorectal cancer specifically, increases by 18% if you have a 50-gram portion of processed meat daily. So that's one sausage, 1 or 2 sticks of bacon, maybe 1 slice or 2 slices of lunch meat. Not a huge amount there. And they say this was assessed by reviewing 800 studies. It doesn't compare smoking to processed meat consumption or asbestos inhalation to processed meat consumption, but it put it in the same category as that. And people who don't know or understand how the classification system works, because the media hasn't really done a good job at explaining that, see that, oh my goodness, smoking is as bad for you as cancer. No, all it means is that they both have probable carcinogens. That's basically what it is. So the ability for someone to form colorectal or bowel cancer because of their consumption of processed meat has risen by 18%, nearly 20%. Well, what does that really mean? For starters, it doesn't mean that I'm giving up bacon. I want to make that abundantly clear. But secondly, it's all about understanding relativity. People mistake something rising by 18% with something rising to 18%. So what they're doing is they're peddling relative risk. Eating a hot dog every day doesn't make you 1 in 5 in terms of the chances of having cancer. It means it makes you 18% more likely than had you not done it. Now, according to the American Cancer Society, you have a 4.84 chance of developing colorectal cancer in your lifetime. Now, according to the numbers released by the WHO, your risk will then go up to 5.7%, which means that you're dealing with something of less than 1% of an overall increase. So you're dealing with a case that is not at all decisively increasing people's ability to get more cancer in any sort of marked way. All it's doing is increasing it relative to the risk that's already there. The risk that's already there, however, is far greater in impact, I think, because it's already 1 in 20. It doesn't really change that much when you add that extra 18%. Now, herein lies the problem, because I looked at a number of stories before I was doing the podcast today, and I was trying to get a sense of which media outlets were reporting it. And I found, and I looked at a dozen right off the bat. The first ones that came up, I had the BBC page, I had New York Times, I had Globe and Mail, I had all mainstream media outlets from Canada and the U.S. Every single one of them mentioned the increase in 18% risk. Not one of them mentioned what the actual rate of developing it is. It was readily available in the study. The WHO provided that. But media members didn't want to report that because it's not as interesting, nor as sensational, nor as conducive to bolstering the nanny state. So as Breitbart.com wrote, kind of criticizing the media's coverage of this, the reality that we all face if we double our intake of bacon is that our chance of getting cancer has increased from about 1 in 20 to about 1 in 20. Likewise, eliminating bacon from our diets completely reduces our chances of getting cancer from about 1 in 20 to, well, about 1 in 20. So on Monday, the media could have just as legitimately reported, and I continue to quote here, that the WHO found that doubling the amount of bacon we eat has almost no impact on whether or not we get cancer. But again, no development means no news. It's also hard to get your research grant money flowing, the piece in Breitbart alleges, for such a report. And, oh, man, he steals my pinch of salt thing. I didn't read to the very bottom paragraph before. He steals my pinch of salt pun. In any case, the problem is here you get World Health Organization, which does have to justify its own existence, but media outlets that are really being dishonest here, in part because they don't understand it, but a bigger part is because it is disingenuousness that can be used to generate clicks. And that is exactly fine for them. I would like to believe that we can sort of rise above that, and we see it with politics as well. You know, there was an old joke that I heard on a Frasier episode once of Daphne, who's the British housekeeper, basically saying that, at one point in Britain, there was a mainstream media outlet that had, or a tabloid magazine rather, that had a cover that said, high-ranking British politician caught wearing women's clothes, and she said, and then when you get inside, you realize that it's Margaret Thatcher, but by that point, you've already bought the paper. And I think that's a more exaggerated example of what's happening here. So who is the World Health Organization to tell me what to eat or what not to eat? No one. Which brings me to, I think, the far more important point here, which is that most people do not at all need help to figure out what is healthy or unhealthy. Most people know. People who eat like fraternity students know exactly what they're doing. Now, some people may underestimate things. Some people may underestimate, especially things like sodium and fat, things that you don't really know, or even calories. People may underestimate things like preservatives and how much of an impact they make. But at the end of the day, a chocolate brownie is a chocolate brownie. A piece of cake is a piece of cake. A cheeseburger is a cheeseburger. People know what these things are. And people know that they're not good for you. And I think that people should have the right to eat as unhealthily as they want, and they can do this knowing that they are basically putting their lives at risk. If you listen to all of the nanny state people and the nutrition campaigns and all that sort of stuff. And who cares? And this is what the left will say. Oh, but if they get a heart attack or get cancer, it's the taxpayers who have to pay for it. So it is our problem. If you want an easy response to that, just say, hey, privatize healthcare. Problem solved. You privatize healthcare, and all of a sudden, you don't need to worry about me. A friend of mine who smokes like a chimney has actually said to me something that I think has a lot of merit. He said, and I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, but you know what, I want to just to spite people sometimes, but I haven't gone that far yet. But my smoker friend has said that he thinks he should actually get priority healthcare. He thinks he should go to the front of the line. He said he'll die younger, so he'll, first off, save the state a lot of money from needing to support him when he's retired, but also that all the money he's paid in cigarette taxes has gone towards health care. He thinks he's deserving premium treatment. And you know what? It's hard to argue with that logic. You've paid more for it, so why not? Go to the front of the line, right? Obviously, that's in jest, but you know what? Never let anyone use socialized medicine or Canada's so-called universal health care as a piece of evidence in favor of allowing the nanny state to grow, because this is what government wants. And it's the same as calorie counts on menus. People have said, oh, well, of course they should do that. Does anyone honestly believe that looking at a calorie count on a menu is going to give you any more or less insight into how healthy or unhealthy the food is? No, it'll make people more guilty. One restaurateur in Toronto, because Toronto did a pilot project, and most restaurants said the cost was too much to deal with. They also said that all that people would do is they just get the lowest calorie dessert anyway, but they still get dessert. And this is what's funny, is that people would be like, oh, I'm going to, do this to save, 100 calories, but they're still getting a dessert, which is ostensibly not going to be a healthy option. And one other element that came out of that, which I found to be a really interesting one, was that people don't understand what 1,000 calories is, for example. It's the same as what we were talking about before with the actual risk of cancer. People only assess calories based on their relativity to each other. So if you have 10 menu options and each of them are 900 calories and then you have one that's 800 calories, people are going to say, oh, that's the healthy one. But conversely, if you have everything on a menu and everything's 1,500 calories and one thing's 1,200 calories, people are going to say, oh, okay, that's the healthy one. you know what? A 1,200 calorie dessert, probably not the best for you. 1,200 calorie entree might not actually be the best for you either. But people are being played by a media that is knowingly playing to the lowest common denominator, and partially because the people writing it don't actually know much about what they're talking about either. I'm no expert in health and nutrition. In fact, if I hopped on a scale, you would laugh if I ever gave you fitness advice or health advice. But I know what I don't know. And this seems to be the biggest inadequacy in the mainstream media today. And this whole war on bacon scare, I think, did nothing but reiterate that in my eyes and those of countless others. We've got to take a quick break here, but more Lawton Online coming up in just a few moments here on TheRebel.Media. Fearless commentary whenever and wherever you want it. We'll be right back, folks. Stay tuned.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
And we are back here on TheRebel.Media's Lawton Online. My name's Andrew Lawton, and every now and then there is a story that comes up that I look at, and I go, please, please, please let this be true. Please let this be real. And then I click on it, and it's not. And I get disappointed, and I move on. But sometimes I click on it, and I realize, yes, this is real. This is a bona fide, real, honest-to-goodness, true story, and my goodness, is it a glorious one. And it has to do with communists being sad. Now, you may remember the grandfather, if you will, of communism is Karl Marx, who is held up as being some sort of icon, even though he himself was somewhat of a capitalist anyway, which is another story in another episode. But Karl Marx has become a hero to the left. You see him basically memorialized on a regular basis. People put up quotes of him. There's the Marxist-Leninist Party in Canada. There's also the Communist Party of Canada because, even they can't join forces together. And what happens is people flock to his grave every year, every day, especially in the summer. He's buried at Highgate Cemetery in London. There's a very large tomb there. There's a fence around it. People will take pictures of him. There is a large monument and a mausoleum and a bust of him. Beard and all. Great detail work on the beard there. And this is the man who is the father of a movement that has never really succeeded, but a movement that the left would love to succeed. And this is the best part about it. If you want to see it, if you want to get to the grave, if you want to get into Highgate Cemetery to visit and photograph the tomb of the grandfather of communism, you have to pay $6. Oh yes, there is an admission fee to see the gravesite of Karl Marx, Capitalism at its best. The market at work. It costs £4, and communists are very sad about it. There was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal that was talking to some of these people that have been impacted by this. One person is a young man, a 24-year-old political activist, because, of course, what other job would he had, named Ben Gliniecki. He doesn't think it's fair. He's the one that really brought this up. He said, there are no depths of irony or bad taste to which capitalists won't sink if they think they can make money out of it. It's not actually irony at all. The charity that looks after the cemetery needs to fund it, especially with the grass being trampled and upkeep being necessary and the possibility of vandalism. But they thought it was interesting that Karl Marx decided to buy a private plot in a London graveyard over the state-provided alternatives. Now, their cover fee keeps up the cemetery. They use it to maintain it. They have about 170,000 people laid to rest there. And I find it laughable that people aren't mad at Karl Marx for getting a plot in a private cemetery instead of being, buried with the people. Now, they started charging in the early 90s. So this has been going on for 20-some-odd years, and it's only been in the past couple of months that people outside of those there have started to notice this. Apparently, it's a beautiful, beautiful space. Interest in his legacy is obviously renewed in Britain following the election of a Marxist, Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, which is official opposition. This 24-year-old political activist actually sells copies of the Socialist Appeal, so that he's a diehard. There's a Marxist student federation, according to the Wall Street Journal, that has seen a surge in new members. And the Cemetery Group is now expecting an uptick in interest in the Karl Marx tomb. They get about 200 visitors a day, most asked to see Marx. So this man who died in 1883 bought the plot for $4.86. That's the equivalent. Now, $6 a day times 200 is what they're making for it. I hope they are profiting hugely off of this. I hope that this is all going to profit. I know it's a charity, but I hope they're going to bloated salaries and expenditures and donations to capitalism because, my goodness, this is just great. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Karl Marx died a capitalist, apparently, and now communists are sad. And the thing that I find funny is that every time I think communism is finally dead, something always happens, something that brings it back, which is absolutely great, because when we see this, they have a real grievance, by the way. They're not doing this to spite people, which is why I find the ire of the commies especially interesting. No, they've actually had two plots to blow it up. In 1970, someone tried to cut off his nose and push explosives into it, but it failed and the bomb was actually set off somewhere else. In 1975, someone took control of the ground that was then decaying because of all of the wear and tear on it. And ultimately, the head of the cemetery has pointed out to the fact that he even pawned his wife's silver. She said in 2008 in an interview, he led a capitalist life. And this is absolutely great. Because when we look at what's happening in Britain, and Jeremy Corbyn, not someone I've studied extensively, but someone who I know sort of all the key details about, it's dangerous to have a Marxist as the potential next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Especially when we look at the shift to the left that we've had in Canada, a Liberal Premier in Ontario, Socialist Premier in Alberta, and a Liberal who leans Socialist as Prime Minister designate in Canada. And then you have David Cameron, who is a lukewarm conservative at best. You have all of these bastions of freedom in the world that are going to the dogs by shifting to the left. And it makes sense that the UK will go in that direction as well. I wish that UKIP had done better, but it doesn't seem like they're within striking distance of pretty much anything. And one more thing I forgot to mention, by the way. I thought of this and I saw a few tweets pointing this out. The fact that Karl Marx has a grave site and a monument better than anyone else's there is also interesting as well. Now, I don't know if he was responsible for that, but the fact that communists want that as well, when everyone else is down there with just a little 2-foot-tall headstone, again, irony is absolutely delicious. We've got to take a quick break here, folks. When we come back, we'll be chatting with Mark Towhey, former Chief of Staff to Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, about his new book, Uncontrollable. That's coming up in just a couple of moments here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.Media.
Well, he is a love him or hate him kind of guy, and I happen to love him, by the way, and I make no bones about that. He is former Toronto Mayor and current City Councillor Rob Ford, and the long-awaited tell-all book about Rob Ford's time as mayor, the times that people really, really care about, has finally been released by his former Chief of Staff, Mark Towhey. Now, we'll talk to Mark in just a moment, but I wanted to give you a little bit of the backstory here. Now, Mark Towhey was fired by Rob Ford in the midst of the crack scandal where the Toronto Star's Robin Doolittle had published the story about the video and published the description of the video. The video that, by the way, to this day has still never seen the light of day publicly. And This was, and I remember being in media at the time, a daily issue. Every day for at least a week, but even 2 weeks, there was a new Rob Ford story. Every day there was something else that happened, some development, and even when we thought we were done, people wanted to hear more. So the world was interested, not just Toronto, not just Canada even, but the whole world was interested in the man who was later known as still arguably known as the crack-smoking mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford. Jon Stewart had devoted a huge number of episodes to him, and politically, his career still went on. He was reelected to city council after he withdrew from the recent mayoral race. Doug Ford ran instead and lost, but only narrowly, to John Tory. So what do you say about this larger-than-life character? Is any allegation going to damn him? To start, I'm so glad it seems like he's getting help. And while he is not a mayor nor a mayoral candidate anymore, he still is in public office, so there still, I think, is some level of interest here. But is it appropriate? Do people have a right to know about the details now that he's no longer the mayor of Toronto? To talk about this and more broadly about some of the stories from back then, we are joined by Mark Towhey, former chief of staff to the mayor and now the author of Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable: How I Tried to Help the World's Most Famous Mayor. Mark, it is great to have you on the show, sir. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Andrew.
So you are also a colleague in radio, I should add as well. You have a weekly show in Toronto. Talk to me a little bit about why writing the book now, because now that Ford has left the public life, I guess in some way he's still a public figure. Is there still, from what you've seen, a public appetite to know more about what's happening and what has happened in the past?
I think there is, and you summed it up pretty well in the intro. I mean, he's just a guy who is in every way, literally and figuratively, larger than life and fascinating to follow. And during that whole experience I was the first guy that he hired on his campaign in 2010 back in March, and then stayed with him through to the time that I was fired in May of 2013. And since that time, a bunch of information has come out about what happened, how he got elected, how he ran into trouble, how things got done at City Hall. A lot of the information that I was previously keeping confidential is now out there in the public, but what was missing was this sort of connective tissue about how it fit together and who did what. And the book covers that whole period from that time when his campaign started in 2010 until the 2014 election. And it talks about the answers to those questions. How did he get elected? Here's how the campaign went from an insider's perspective. The first year in office, he was clean and sober, and an amazing amount of stuff got done when you compare it to other terms of other mayors. And how did that happen? It talks about that, and then, of course, it talks about what happened at the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012, when he clearly started to struggle with his addictions and was losing that battle.
So this was not something, in your view, that was being maintained behind closed doors. This was something that actually, in that first year of office, it wasn't actually an issue?
That's true, yeah. I sat right beside him throughout the campaign. I drove him around in my red Ford Explorer for about 100 debates and briefed him. He was clean and sober during the debate, or during the election campaign in 2010, and he was clean and sober for pretty much all of his first year, right up until sometime at the very end of 2011, things started to look odd.
What was the first moment that you can remember knowing that he was either intoxicated on the job or knowing that there was some form of a substance issue?
I think probably St. Patrick's Day of 2012, March 17th, was the pivotal moment for me and for most of the people in that office. I was not yet chief of staff, but I remember going into a Toronto radio station for his Sunday radio show to just check in and talk with some of the staff and to check in with him the day after that St. Patrick's Day night, which is a bit infamous now. And from that point on, with the antics that had happened that night, he had been out of control in the office. He had taken a party of his friends down to a local beer hall here in Toronto with staff around him trying to sort of corral him and get him back in the box, if you will. And it had gotten out of hand once it got back to the mayor's office. And there was pushing, there was shoving. And from that morning after, in my head, he became the addict. And it was, he had been obviously struggling with alcohol at that point, we knew. And he was losing that battle to the point that from that point on, in my mind, the number one priority was getting this guy help. And we were going to start losing all the other political battles, but it was getting this guy help.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you obviously have to, in your role or in that role at the time, play servant to two masters in a way. I mean, you need to make sure that the city is running. You also need to make sure that there's a public relations or a political success that's going on for the mayor. But you also are closely aligned with this person as a man, not just as a mayor. So what was your top priority? Were you trying to limit the political blowback, or was it the health and well-being of Mayor Ford?
Well, it was all of those things, to be honest. I mean, political staff, at the end of the day, are hired in order to help the politician, in this case the mayor of Toronto, advance the agenda that he was elected to do. And very clearly, in order to do that, he needed to be able to show up and do his job. But we also knew this guy, and we liked him, and he's a human being. So from that point on, we started working on it. I wasn't in charge at that point, but the guy who was, Amir Ramtola, the chief of staff then, we had, a lot of very frank discussions. I think I was a pretty hard employee to deal with at that point, but he took it on himself, which I think is the right role for a chief of staff, to address the issue personally with the mayor. And at that point, we also started looking for rehabilitation or health options or counseling or whatever it could be while we were still advancing the agenda. And I had the easy part at that point. My focus was mostly on keeping the city running and the agenda moving through council. Amir took it on himself, had the hard discussion at that point with the mayor and his family. And frankly, things after that point got better for a few months. And I don't know whether that's because of whatever Amir said or whether that's just a normal sort of bounce back. Once he kind of fell down, often he would get back up and toe the line for a little while.
When we go back to that moment that sort of caused this to explode globally, the report by the Toronto Star of the crack video, the first crack video, we now know. Was there ever a doubt in your mind when you first caught whiff of that story that it was authentic?
Yeah, we didn't know. And that was a problem because we didn't know. Because in our minds, it could be authentic. Based on what we had seen, it could very easily have been true. At that point, I was the chief of staff. Amir had left. And we had a long, pretty thick file that Amir had handed over to me about rehab options and treatment options that were available. And the mayor had clearly been degenerating in terms of his ability to do his job for months leading up to that. And we had pushed and tried to sort of corral him back into a healthy path and to manage the files we were managing. But on the night that the Gawker story came out, he denied that there was a video. I, though, didn't know. Well, in fact, I didn't believe him, but I didn't know that there was a video either. So we had to work in an atmosphere of really not knowing what the heck the truth was. But very clearly at that point, and I go through this in the book because it became obvious to us once the Toronto Star story ran as well the same night, was in the papers the next morning, that it frankly didn't matter whether there was a video or not, because everybody would believe there was a video and a number of things would start happening in the community, whether it was true or not. And it was the final straw. Like, this was, because it seemed to me entirely credible that it could be true, that then became the only priority left in the office. And we frankly stopped work on everything else except trying to get him help.
And what's interesting about that, and I remember vividly being in radio at that time, it was always great for content, and unfortunately that was at the expense of what you were trying to do at the time, generally. But we had a period where people were falling into a few different camps. You had the people that say, Rob Ford is a clown, get him out of office. You have the people that say, I don't believe this, the media's out to get him, there's no way this is real. And then you had the third category, which was growing, which is, who cares? Who cares if it was real? It's Rob Ford. We love Rob Ford. Were you really trying to spark that from your end, trying to maintain that support, or was that something that just happened independent of your office?
That is natural and innate to him. And frankly, at that point, we simply didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to focus much outward. So there were, and the irony of it is both the camps that wanted him out and thought he was a clown and the people who thought he was great and doing good work, they're all right. They're both of those groups are right. Rob Ford got a phenomenal amount of stuff done as the mayor, and we had people on the street that would tell me, plus the reporters, that they didn't care if he was on crack. He was still doing what they wanted him to do. And I honestly had a guy in a bank, a $5,000 suit, tell me that Rob Ford on crack was better than any mayor they'd ever had. So keep him. But that was because his political focus was where people wanted. But as a politician, as an operator, he was at that point unable to execute anything. And the week between the Gawker story breaking and me being fired was a very long week indeed. And, we started with sort of three options. We recommended he do rehab and had laid out a plan where he could make a political comeback and, frankly, probably would be mayor today. But after he vetoed that, I just switched to a one-option plan, which was you got to go to rehab. There's no other choice. And every conversation we had focused on that.
Mark, one of the conversations in the book that you overheard was Rob Ford making an allusion to shooting his wife. So that was obviously a pretty memorable moment. And there have been other examples as well of things you've heard that just must have made you cringe. And I know that people have said that you were an enabler to Rob Ford. How do you respond to that? What were you looking back, or do you have no regrets about the part that you played?
I don't have any regrets about my part, and I would say that if I and any of the staff enabled anything, it was enabling the continued function of government in Toronto. We did not enable his addiction in any way, shape, or form. I dismissed that particular side of that accusation.
So there weren't any moments that you look back on and you sort of wish that you had handled differently? You wish you had maybe found a way to call police, or wish you had maybe been more adamant in your resolve when you were urging him to go into rehab?
No, I don't think it would be. Were there things throughout that 4-year period or 3-year period that I could have done better? I'm sure there's an infinite number of things that we could have done better, myself particularly. But the accusations and the concerns with regard to that phone call, for example, I think are based in a limited amount of knowledge that comes from reading an excerpt in a magazine. The phone call that kind of raised a bit of a public stink and concern was a 1 hour and 40-minute conversation that he had with me at 3 o'clock, beginning just before 3 o'clock in the morning one night. And these were not unusual from him. He, even clean and sober, used to have difficulty sleeping and would pick up the phone at any time of the night and call staff. And I didn't bear the brunt of that, frankly. It was rare for him to call me until I became chief of staff, and even then he didn't abuse that very much. He knew I had a family. But drunken phone calls from him had become the norm by that point, and a lot of the staff would get them every night for long periods of time. This was one that, as I said, started in the wee hours of the morning, lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. And I took notes through it, which is my habit. But he was out of it. I picked up the phone. He was almost incoherent. He was speaking very quickly. It was hard to understand a lot of what he was saying. I could hear his wife in the background. It was pretty clear they were having a knockdown, drag-out argument with each other, and he had wanted to call me to have a witness by phone of what was going on. And he made some accusations there that were pretty ugly about her. And he said that he did at one point say that he wanted to harm her, and he mentioned a gun. But the gun, when I probed him immediately, because obviously that's a huge red flag, his statements were always, I want to get this, or I can't find it, or I was looking for it. And as I probed him, it became clear in my judgment at the time that this was Rob putting on a show for me, that there wasn't a gun. He and I had talked about guns before, so I had some foreknowledge that they didn't have one. And in my judgment through that call, it came very close, and I was looking for indicators that there might be some physical violence at some point. There never was. They weren't together for that whole time either. A large part of the time he was alone, and another part of the house just rambling on to me. But in my judgment, and I've dealt with him for 3 years at this point. I've got a background in crisis management and dealing with guns and people who shoot at each other for half of my career. I just judged that there wasn't any danger that was imminent. And so although I prepared myself to call 911 and had the phone pre-dialed, I never judged it necessary.
What was as you saw anyway from your seat, the family dynamic like between, Rob and his brother, and specifically Rob and his wife during all of this?
I go into that a little bit in the book. I really don't want to hash it out on the air with regards to his wife. She's not an elected official, and I'm always, even in the book, I was very uncomfortable about getting into that. But there is a certain amount of that's necessary in order to understand him and what was happening with him and his job. So I've kind of tried to limit it to that, the very minimum that's required. He and his brother have a relationship that I think is probably like a lot of brothers. When they're together in public, they're a unified force. They are a single team. And although Doug will sometimes poke fun at Rob in public around the weight challenge and things like that, you'll never see Rob ever take a shot at his brother in public. Never. Unless it's extremely in jest a little bit when they were on the radio, they'd poke fun a little bit. But behind closed doors, they're like every other pair of siblings, I would think, and they're incredibly competitive with each other. They often argue and fight, and they'll go weeks, if not months, without speaking to each other. And so throughout his period as mayor, there were times when they were right on the same track working together, and other times when they were fighting behind the scenes and hadn't spoken to each other in months. And our best efforts as staff were to try to steer the ship in the direction Rob told us to steer it and stay out of the way so that we didn't get between them, because nothing good could come of that.
So when you were fired by Rob Ford, was this a personal thing, or was this, hey, sorry, Mark, I like you, but this is just business? The actual firing, very few words. I detail it in the book, sort of almost blow by blow. But it was very professional. But it had gotten to that point after a week after the Gawker thing, where, quite frankly, I had pretty much removed all of the options from his table except rehab. And no matter what the conversation was, that he was bringing something up or I was bringing something up with him, it always basically very quickly turned to, Rob, that's interesting, but it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is you getting well. And the only way you're going to do that is to do this. And I pushed him very hard for a week, knowing quite well that there were going to be one of two outcomes. Either he was going to roll over and do what I wanted him to do and go away and get healthy, or he was going to fire me. And at that point, to be honest, Andrew, I think either one of those looked like a win from my perspective. Do you have today a personal relationship with Rob Ford? Have you at all had the time sort of to look back on this now that he appears to be in a better place, or have you completely sort of gone separate ways?
I haven't spoken with him since the day that he fired me. I have spoken with his brother Doug a few times, but I'm very happy to see that he finally did get healthy. Really saddened about the cancer that he fought, but he seems to have done a great job with that. Did reach out to the family to see if I could visit him when he was desperately sick. But he wasn't in a position to take visitors outside of close family. But he looks better than he's ever looked, even when I saw him clean and sober. So I'm hoping his health has come back and he'll be able to keep it together. I
guess the last question I'd ask you, Mark, if you take the drugs and alcohol away from Rob Ford, is he kind of one of the best mayors Toronto's ever seen in your eyes? If he had been able to do that term the way that he did the first year?
Yeah, if drugs and alcohol hadn't entered the picture and he remained healthy, I think he would be mayor again still today. I think he would easily won re-election. Doug Ford damn near beat John Tory, and he jumped into the race 30 days before the election. And Doug, as smart as he is, doesn't have the natural sort of likability factor that Rob Ford does. So I think the people of Toronto, the majority of them, respond very well to the types of things that Rob Ford was wanting to do for them as mayor. And that's because the types of things he wanted to do for them as mayor was what he was hearing people by the thousands ask for. And he's responsive like that. So I think we could do with a few more politicians who listen like he does, but without all of the drama.
Mark Towhey joins me on the line, author of the book, Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable, How I Tried to Help the World's Most Notorious Mayor. Mark, fascinating read, almost through it, but I really appreciate your time today, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a pleasure to join you.
One item that Mark mentioned a couple of moments ago is that he had laid out a plan for how Rob Ford could make a political comeback and still be mayor today. Is it even still possible? You know, as much as I would love to see it, partially for the entertainment value, because Rob Ford is an entertaining mayor and was, I suppose, an entertaining mayor. And if you ever want one of the quintessential Rob Ford moments, one of the ones that was earlier on in his time in office, because he hadn't actually taken office yet. It was the day or a couple of days after the election. He was doing a CBC radio interview. They had lined it up already, and he was doing this on his cell phone while he was coaching a football game. And she's asking him questions, and he's just not there. He's just not on the interview. He's saying, yeah, gravy train. No, run the ball. Pick it up and go. Yeah, we're going to end the gravy train. No, pick it up and go. Yeah, the people have spoken. Yeah, okay, no, get to the locker room. It's just not there. And people are so frustrated. If I were in radio and I were the one doing the interview, I would be so frustrated because I'd be thinking, what the heck? What kind of a jerk is this? But you know what? Listening to it as just a citizen, and not even a Toronto citizen, but as a Canadian citizen, I'm like, man, this is the guy who is there for the people. Everyone can relate to him. He makes people laugh. He's friendly. Doug is the brash one, but even then, the two make a good team. And I've always said that Doug Ford is Rob Ford without the charm. Because even though Rob Ford is a lot less polished than Doug Ford, it's that lack of polish that seems to make him more popular. So do I think that either one is ever going to be prime minister? Absolutely not. Could Rob Ford make a comeback as mayor? You never know. His fans certainly haven't gone away. Should he? That's another question altogether. But you know what? If what that guy said that Mark relayed, that Rob Ford on crack is better than anyone else, is viewed and believed by a great deal of people in Toronto, and I know it is for a fact by at least a handful, maybe he could and have no issues whatsoever. We've got to take a quick break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online here on TheRebel.Media. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.Media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
We are back here on the podcast that is likely to change minds, break hearts, and make history any given day of the week when you listen. Even though it's a weekly show, we just have that much impact here. Folks, we are in a very strange time. I have, throughout the week, every time I've done this show, amassed a collection of notes and things and articles and stories and anecdotes and all of these things that I am interested in covering and talking about. And by the time the show day comes around, I usually find that I have too much stuff to go through, so I have to pick the best or pick things that I know I've seen a lot of or pick things that I know The Rebel has covered a lot of and go with something that hasn't gotten as much coverage or sometimes go with what has people talking about. Well, there were a few stories this week that I had put in my little note files here. And it's real. They're actually files. Here, let me just... See, it's a real file. Or I could have just crumpled any random sheet of paper. Either way, I have them in front of me here. And they're all smaller stories. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I just sort of have one segment where I go through a bunch of these little nuggets, if you will, that are all part of a common theme, which is this idea of race baiting and hypersensitivity to race and overabundance that we see in media of idiocy in the realm of, mainstream media, in the realm of workplace politics, employment discrimination, this so-called culture of human rights tribunals. So I have three that I'm going to try to weave together here, or if not, talk about each one of them independently, because two of them are really close. One of them is just an example of an MSNBC personality being a moron. Now, that in and of itself is as far from news as someone saying that water is indeed wet, lest there have been any confusion. But a guest on MSNBC was talking about Paul Ryan, who was going to be taking over as Speaker, and they were discussing this. And the guest, a conservative pundit, said, if there's somebody who is a hard worker when he goes to Washington, it's Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, very well liked. Obviously, now people are starting to turn on him and call him a rhino, but I think he'll be good in his post. I think he's a decent and smart guy. And even though I don't get to cover as much in the way of U.S. politics as I used to, I have a lot of people in my network that speak very fondly, both personally and as well as politically, about him. And I've seen great stuff from him in the past as well. So I think he's going to be good in that portfolio as speaker. But I will say that the quote that you just read, that I just read to you, I didn't know would spark a controversy, but it did. Because he said, if there's somebody who's a hard worker when he goes to Washington, it's Paul Ryan. Now, here is what Melissa Harris Perry said in response. This is, I remind you, lest there have been any confusion, on MSNBC. She said, quote, I just want to pause on one thing. Because I don't disagree with you that I actually think Mr. Ryan is a great choice for this role. But I want us to be super careful when we use the language hard worker. Because I actually keep an image of folks working in cotton fields on my office wall because it is a reminder about what hard work looks like. In the context of relative privilege, I just want to point out that when you talk about work-life balance and being a hard worker, the moms who don't have health care, who are working, we don't call them hard workers. We call them failures, people who are sucking off the system. Then the guest said, really? Y'all do? He shook his head. He said, that's really what you do? He was baffled at this. I watched the clip and I'm baffled at this. Now, let me give you one key piece of information that I didn't give to you before. His name, Alfonso Aguilar. And he is the executive director of the American Principles Project's Latino Partnership. So this is a guy who understands what it's like to be a minority in America. But Melissa Harris Perry is saying that it is rude and insensitive because of slavery to call someone a hard worker. Yeah. So I was baffled by this. Now, here's where it gets hilarious, because when you do something like that and you criticize a piece of language, now obviously Harris Perry is in fact black, so she has a personal connection as a black American to the slavery issue, in that she feels an attachment to that and a need to remember the absolute shame attached to that point in America's history. But here's the problem. Washington Post reporter Eric Wemple did what I think any sensible journalist would do when someone criticizes such an innocuous use of language. He found a number of examples of her using the term hard work. For example, in February, Harris Perry told an NBC correspondent that her coverage during a blizzard was, quote, hard work. She said it twice. In September, she said, quote, what I don't want to miss is that policing is in fact hard work, unquote. August 30th, she was talking about Ben Carson, and she said, I think, quote, that hard work is necessary, but insufficient condition for success. On May 3rd, she was talking about a group of Baltimore teenagers and said, quote, thank you for the work that you are doing on the ground there. Stay safe, keep positive, and keep doing the hard work, unquote. Now, none of them were, as the Washington Post reporter Eric Wemple points out, none of them were actually slaves. And then one time, she played a video of Hillary Clinton using the term hard work. Didn't criticize. Also, other guests have used it, and she didn't criticize. Now, I don't think she should have been criticizing these people. I just don't think she should have been criticizing someone who called a conservative a hard worker because of slavery. And this reminds me of that story I was talking about from Western University a few weeks ago, my alma mater, about words that are so innocuous and benign that people don't even realize could be construed as offensive, like whitewashed, like lame, like stupid, like insane, things that are just so common, have no connotation attached to them that is negative whatsoever, but people are still getting their panties in a wad, their gender-neutral undergarments in a wad about them. And it's all part of this culture of race baiting, which I find interesting because it's now the subject of an employment discrimination complaint filed by an Ottawa man, a Canada Revenue Agency worker who said that he's being discriminated against because of his race. His name is Joe Bate. He's representing himself, in federal court, but it's about the Employment Equity Act. And here's the thing, he's white. The 40-year-old white man has said that he's been passed over despite being, quote, twice as efficient, has better communication skills, but unfortunately, I was born white. And he said the Employment Equity Act has excluded him because it focuses on the guaranteed inclusion of women, minorities, aboriginals, and disabled persons. But he said it excludes one specific group. The question he asked rhetorically was, what a vicious cycle of discrimination. Saying to the Toronto Sun, I feel as an able-bodied white male, I'm the only person excluded by a law meant to benefit all Canadian citizens. And I feel my employer has gone beyond the requirements of the law to represent members of the 4 categories and not me. Now, he thought he was a lock, but his bosses allegedly made it clear that the promotion would go to someone in one of the designated groups. He went on disability after developing mental health issues, which he claims were brought by the stress of standing up to his employer. He submitted evidence that in his eyes anyway, opens the discussion and proves that he was the most qualified because he's well above the requirements that CRA has and has been for 12 years. And I think it's funny. I mean, I can't tell if he's doing this to be a troll, in which case I say well played, or genuinely has a chip on his shoulder, in which case I say, okay, come on. Even though we know it's true and we know that affirmative action lives on through the Employment Equity Act, at the end of the day, is this going to do anything about it? But I find it funny because if he does indeed have evidence, and if employers have been saying to him what he claims they've said, which is that, hey, we have to do this, we have to go with someone else, then I find it absolutely hilarious. Because then you all of a sudden have this leftist policy cannibalizing. And hey, especially with the transgender movement being where it is, he should really just identify as women. And then, he'll have eventually a Woman of the Year award like Caitlyn Bruce Jenner just did a couple of days ago. So when we look at the employment discrimination thing, though, the simple question should be, can you do the job? Can you do the job you were hired to do? Can you do the job, and are you doing the job that you signed on to do? And that's it. No other factor should be relevant. And that brings me to story number 3 here, which is really well timed after a summer of media coverage being dominated by the quintessential example of small business rights and discrimination now, a gay baker, or rather a gay wedding couple, and a Christian baker. This has been basically the model example when we look at what rights you have as a small business owner and what rights you have as a apparent marginalized group when it comes to imposing your will on others and what imposing actually is. Well, the interesting thing about that is that courts that have weighed in on this have ruled that gay people have a right to get a wedding cake from a Christian. Forget about we have the right to refuse service to anyone. That is no longer a thing. But then we have this other story here that came actually out of the federal court in the United States. A federal jury in Peoria, Illinois, awarded $240,000 to 2 Muslim men who were fired from their jobs as truck drivers when they refused to transport alcohol because it violated their religious beliefs. Now, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission brought the case up. The trial started on October 19th and was later decided. And what happened after that was hilarious. The jury, and the judge obviously endorsed it, revealed that, yes, these men should have kept their jobs, and they've been given now not only back pay, but also punitive damages. $100,000 each in punitive damages for the hassle that it caused them to not have a job. Now, I don't know if they signed a contract, I couldn't find this in the case, that ever said they would have to transport alcohol, or if there was ever a contract they signed that said, this is what you are allowed to be exempt from. But that was never something that came up in news coverage. So what we have here is a double standard. In one case, it's okay for you to use your religion to justify what you do and can't do. And in another case, it's unacceptable to invoke your religion to justify what you can and can't do. In one example, we're dealing with people who own a business. In another example, you're dealing with people who are employers of the business. But both lead to what I think should be the norm and should be the status quo, which is any business, any company, any organization being about voluntary relationships between three stakeholders: owners, employees, customers. Employers, employees, clients, however you want to frame it, that should be the balance that we try to keep. Keep as many of those as you can happy. Employees need to advocate for better contracts, which is just not done because they assume that the government or some human rights commission will protect them. Employers oftentimes will cut corners, and I think they need to be held to account as well, but it can be done by employees and by consumers. And underlying all three of these, underscoring them, is the market prevailing. And it's like I've said with the whole wedding cake thing. Look, if a gay couple doesn't want to support what they see as bigotry, they can go somewhere else. If a Christian couple doesn't want to see what they support as debauchery and sin, they don't have to bake the cake for the gay couple. That's completely within their rights as a business owner, or should I say it should be within their rights as a business owner. But here's the funny thing. Why would any gay couple want to give money and give business to anyone that doesn't agree with what they're doing? With someone that had to be forced to do it? Especially since there's nothing in the law that says you can't cut corners on the cake, use, shortening instead of butter because it's a gay couple or whatnot. Not that I encourage it. Or for that matter, that it has to be that good. I mean, you can just, leave it out for a day and whatnot and just make sure that the contract cuts corners and you're not promising anything that you can't deliver on or that you won't deliver on. But why does a gay couple want to give the money? And for that matter, could the Christian owners of the bakery just say, all right, but we're charging you $5,000. That's our price. That's our rate for this project. Everything's a custom quote. That's how much it'll cost you. And here's the thing, and the fact that this has become the pillar example of employment discrimination is because it's something that, first off, is fun to talk about. Everybody likes cake. But secondly, because it was one isolated example that then became and begat more examples. And it allows the media to turn on Christians as the enemies here. How dare they bring their religion into the workplace? You have to leave it at the door. First off, if you're religious, you cannot leave your beliefs anywhere. I mean, you can, depending on your religion. If you're, part of the United Church, I think you can. But they don't really have many anyway from the ones that I've spoken to. So what are we actually seeing here? What are we actually expecting to come of this? If you believe something, that's something that is obviously going to be with you no matter where you are. So why are Muslims not expected to also leave their religions at the door of their trucks? Why are they given special privileges and given a payout in the form of $250,000 just because they had to deal with the inconvenience of being fired for not doing the job they were hired for? What should have happened here, what I wish happened here, was the employer would say, well, actually, you signed a contract saying you'd transport whatever we gave you. So you're not fulfilling this, you're fired. Or the driver saying, well, wait, you never told us we'd have to do alcohol. We took the job not knowing that was an option, so you can't fire me. And it is the contract that wins out. That is the most important thing here. People need to advocate for themselves. People need to be their best advocates and leave these so-called human rights claims and the other derivatives of them, your Equal Opportunity Office, your Equal Opportunity Employment Act in Canada, your human rights commissions, your tribunals, etc. Leave them out of the equation altogether because these are bodies that deal with feelings, not facts. We've got to take a quick break here. When we come back, final wrap-up of Lawton Online here on the fearless Rebel.Media. Stay tuned.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, from Albania to Armenia, from Austria to Azerbaijan, and from Zambia to Zimbabwe, we find these stories so outrageous from all corners of the globe and bring them to you. Examples of spoiled, bratty entitlement. It is time for It Must Be a Liberal. And beyond spoiled, bratty entitlement, also just things that people do that happen that you just wonder, how on earth could that happen? And that leaves the only possible explanation, hence the name of the segment. Well, today we go to Michael Baker, who is not necessarily the portrait of an intelligent criminal. He's from Phoenix, Arizona. And he posted a picture on Facebook of him flipping the camera off while siphoning gas from a parked police car. Not only was he doing this, but you could see his face. He posted it to his own Facebook page. You could see the city of the car and the number of the police car and him siphoning it. He was 20 years old and, well, he wasn't smiling all that much in his mugshot. Now, this may be true, but the fact is this is a crime born of someone who doesn't understand the limitations of social media, which is interesting because once he was let out on bail, he posted to Facebook, quote, "LOL, I went to jail over Facebook." Yeah, the future of the country not looking that bright. And when that happens, it's safe to say there's only one possible explanation. It must be a liberal. Friends, there's no other possibility whatsoever. We have to wrap things up for the show today, folks, but we will be back with one final episode before I go to Israel in 2 weeks. But we'll talk about that next week on the Lawton Online podcast here on TheRebel.Media. So yes, there is going to be a show next week, but not in 2 weeks. But again, we'll make sure we have something planned to make it worth your while to tune in when I come back. This is Lawton Online, friends. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.Media for lots more fearless content and commentary.